Dr. Courtney G. Flint. She is a natural resource sociologist at Utah State University. She has published widely on perceptions and actions of people and communities within changing social and environmental conditions. Her research projects in recent years, her research projects in recent years have focused on community dimensions of forest disturbance in Alaska and Colorado, factors influencing agriculture and nutrient management practices in Illinois, and social dimensions of water resource sustainability in Utah. Dr. Flint also serves on the United States Environmental Protection Agency Board of Scientific Counselors. Please welcome Dr. Flint.
All right, can we get the new slides perhaps onto the screen? It's nice to be with you. Thanks so much for having me. Appreciate being a part of this conference today. I've changed my title just a tiny bit from what's in the program. And so today I will be speaking about navigating the human-nature relationships and how ecosystem disturbances are experienced and anticipated in the Western United States. So I cut my research teeth on forest disturbances in the Western U.S., starting in Alaska starting in about 2002, and then continued to work my way southward into Colorado with mountain pine beetles and spruce bark beetles down there. And I've been here in Utah where the situations, I was brought here to work a little bit more on water resources and anticipating some of these changes that Beck just talked about, thinking about the form of our precipitation and thinking about our storage capacity in an ever-growing state with our typical Western water ideals about what our values are. How do we navigate those in a changing, very urban northern Utah Wasatch Front area? So again, coming from forest into a water situation and largely thinking of these things that we've treated in somewhat as in silos and have studied somewhat separately, really coming together as we think about full landscape and ecosystem connectivity as we anticipate both social and climatological and ecological changes in the future. It all seems to come together. So in terms of responding to ecosystem disturbances that roll out throughout our regions and our landscapes, the question to me is, what do people draw on to make their response decisions? And we often think that and as we're here today, we've got resource managers and scientists in the room, and a lot of times the conclusion is that we just need information and we need to get it into the right hands, and with the right information, people will make the right response decisions. This often is referred to as the information deficit model, right? That if there's a lack of information, if we can address that deficit, bring the level of information up with some good science, we'll see the right responses and behaviors following in line. This is along the lines of informing environmental attitudes and pro-environment, the proper environmental responses and behaviors by infusing environmental knowledge into the situation. The thing is since this model came out here in 1998, we've seen tons of evidence that this just really doesn't work that well. And so what we have are quite a few barriers to information, changing attitudes, and motivating actions in our landscapes. And that's because the sources of our information are not always trusted, and there's not necessarily a ton of confidence in the source of this information, right or wrong, but what's perceived to be real is real in its consequences, right? We also have a lot of other internal and external factors to people, to communities, to societies that can enable and constrain action. So even with the right, according to the best science attitude and the desire to take the right, according to the science, action or behavior, we don't always, we aren't situated in a position to be able to have the free choice or to be able to take those actions even if we see them as being the right pathway to take. So let's see if I'm in the right place. we skipped something. Here we go. So, you know, oftentimes when we think about behaviors, you know, that's what we can see, the actions people will take, right? And so we think that we can influence them by simply nudging that iceberg a little bit with some information. And what we sometimes forget is what's underneath our actions, our deeply rooted values and beliefs and worldviews that make those behaviors a little bit difficult to nudge along. When's the last time you made a truly rational decision? Sometimes as people, we just aren't quite as rational and predictable as we think we ought to be. We often have some inconsistent thoughts, or we might take some actions that don't necessarily match our values, or vice versa. And so we have some cognitive dissonance. So what do people draw on when they're making sense of ecosystem disturbances and trying to figure out how to respond? Well, yes, we do respond to some information, but that's often mediated by our level of trust and confidence in the source of that information. Think about the landscapes in which you work. Who wears the white hat? Is it you, or is it someone else? And who's the deliverer of the information? Does that make a difference on how it's received? How we frame our information can motivate some people where the information is in line and framed in a way that matches their sense of how the world works, but it can really crowd people out if it assumes a certain value consistency that might not necessarily be present. So what else is going on? Well, in the past 6 or 7 years, some colleagues in Austria and I have been studying something we are calling human nature relationships. How do people perceive their relationship with nature? And in past work, a lot of times coming a lot out of psychology, but also out of philosophy, it was deemed that people have a type of human nature relationship, that they can be, through surveys or other research, we can typify them, we can put them in their type, and then we know what their relationship is, and then we can operate accordingly. Think about this typology here, which is just one of many we've been trying out. You know, there might be some people who don't really think about their human nature relationship, don't think about much about nature in their daily life. There may be folks who are thinking about dominating, sort of controlling human nature, as we just heard about earlier, or changing nature to provide for the needs of people and protect us from hazards. There might be some who understand that a well-functioning ecosystem will provide those services and those things that we need to use as people. Perhaps there are people who feel a moral obligation, a spiritual, religious obligation to care for nature or for future generations. Or maybe there's someone who sees themselves as more being a partner with nature, right? Or a participant, someone who sees nature as much bigger than themselves and being part of nature and has a strong bond with nature. And again, the previous work often tried to say, we are each one of those types. But our research is starting to show that actually we all hold multiple types, conflicting types. You know, when the flood is raging and your house is right there in the way, you really might become a master type pretty quickly. But when you're taking the grandkids out camping, you might really want them to be a participant in nature and understand and be in awe of the natural world around you and everything in between. We're dynamic and we often hold conflicting human nature relationship types. And these are the lenses through which we perceive our ecosystem disturbances. Well, there are a lot of other factors that have been scientifically shown to influence how people make sense of ecosystem disturbances and how they respond. Their values, their emotions, how they perceive risk, whether they're risk tolerant, can handle a little bit of disturbance, or really averse if their interests are at stake. Local culture, the way things work, how we operate as in societies, all those things that are cultural factors. So it's not just what's going on in our own psyche, it's about our social situation and how that's influenced by generations and how it's produced continually in our communities and in our societies. We draw upon word of mouth and social networks, right, beyond just those formal sources of information, and we experience these disturbances as we live and work and play in landscapes, and we draw upon our local knowledge in addition to perhaps professional or scientific knowledge to make sense of these things. Here, this grief cycle is something I didn't learn from psychologists. I learned it from foresters in Alaska on the Kenai Peninsula. They called the Pacific Northwest Research Station and said, we're going to have to get somebody up here who can understand these people in these communities because there is something going wrong and we can't get anything right. So that led to my dissertation work on the Kenai Peninsula. And so these foresters were the one that actually explained the grief cycle to me and said, you know, we've got bark beetles up here and we've got a risk of fire, and we've got some communities that are just denying there's a problem and others that are so angry and really trying to blame somebody, and it's us. We've got some that are so depressed they're crying, and we've got others that are moving away, right, and trying to figure out what to do. And we can't make sense of this situation. But we do know that our forest ecosystem disturbances are an interactive set of things going on. And we know back from the Dale article 15 years ago that our forest disturbance and our forest climate interactions lead to cascading disturbances over time. And so what does that mean to your grief cycle if there's not one disturbance, but perhaps many going on, and a backwards and forwardsness in all of this experiences? Well, I think we might end up with something that looks kind of like this as a grief cycle rather than this nice steady curve. All right, so what I'm going to do is draw on a couple of cases, a little bit of old and a little bit of new, and thinking about how do people experience and anticipate our forest and mountain disturbances, and what actions do people support to mitigate or respond to such disturbances, or what they might oppose. And so I'll draw on some work that I did some time ago on the Kenai Peninsula in Alaska, where spruce bark beetles were working their way through the forests there, conducted interviews and surveys at 2 points in time, and we were able to see how some of these perspectives were changing. Some work was done in the Colorado Rockies, in the northern Colorado, on mountain pine beetle. They also had their share of spruce bark beetles. Again, interviews and surveys to look at this rich sort of experience and expressions of what's going on, as well as those things we could quantify over broader populations in surveys. And then very recently, we've started to look back at the coverage of the beetle experience in Colorado through the news media, and I'll share some of those initial findings with you. And then looking here to our region here in the Wasatch, we've been looking at not just looking at the risks inherent as we look forward into our natural resource and human relationships, but also thinking about our well-being and our values and our benefits that we gain from living in the mountains. And so the bark beetle work, the forest work, was funded largely by the Forest Service, and my work today is largely funded by the experiment station here at Utah State, as well as the iUtah Water Sustainability Project. We'll start with the tale of two Alaska towns. Well, let's orient ourselves here to the Kenai Peninsula here in south central Alaska, where spruce bark beetle outbreaks, and this map is not new. This map is really from about 2004 or 6, where they saw 90% mortality on the southern end of the Kenai Peninsula, and really in a monoculture situation there, it took out trees down to even about 2 inches in diameter. It pretty much wiped out some of those forests, especially in the southern part of the Kenai Peninsula. Well, I studied about 6 communities on the Kenai Peninsula, but I want to focus in on these two up here, and those two in the circle, Cooper Landing and Moose Pass. Anybody ever been to Cooper Landing or Moose Pass? All right, we got one person in the back. These two towns, you know, if you look at them on the map, right, they're both situated, or if you drive through, they look very similar. They situated in these nice narrow valleys. They've got lakes nearby, about 80 to 100 people in these communities. They look largely very similar in the census data, and driving by, you'd think these are just two little identical twins on the Kenai Peninsula. The Kenai Peninsula, they do both have somewhat of a mixed forest, so they didn't see that heavy punch of the spruce bark beetle that they did on the lower part of the peninsula, but they've definitely been grappling with this issue over time. The thing that happened is in 2001, south of Moose Pass, the Forest Service that was trying to do some restoration work, some mitigation work on these bark beetles, went in one morning and started a prescribed burn on the side of the mountainside along by the lake. And they didn't allow local people to get involved, but the local folks were really upset about this fire. And about 5 o'clock, they said, the Forest Service said, well, we got this pretty much under control. We're going to pack it up for the night. And, I think this thing's pretty much bedded down. It'll all be fine. And the locals said, you are out of your mind. About 5 o'clock every day, at this time of year, the winds pick up off the lake, off from the south, and they are going to pick that prescribed burn up, and they're going to blow that fire right into our town, and you're going to burn us out of here. The Forest Service said, you just don't understand. We understand prescribed fires here. We know what we're doing. Just back off and go home. And they came with their bulldozers, and they were ready for this fire, but they wouldn't let them anywhere close to this. They were really worried, and it was a bit of a standoff. The Forest Service pulled off that fire. Sure enough, winds came up that late afternoon, early evening, and picked that fire up and blew it towards Moose Pass. And it was a pretty scary situation for folks there. And that fire in 2001 changed the entire perspective of this community in relation not only to fire, but into the spruce bark beetle situation. Their trusting relationship with the Forest Service was gone. And so they didn't necessarily trust the information on anything out of the Forest Service from that point forward. And it changed the whole dynamic, that in Cooper Landing, they really didn't have this animosity. And so the takeaway message here is that experience matters. What's happening in your landscapes and with your communities, and what kind of an impact does that have on how they perceive changes in their environment? Well, let's tell one more little tale of two towns in Alaska, and that's down here in Anchor Point in Homer. Anybody been down to Homer on the Kachemak Bay on the Kenai Peninsula? It's a gorgeous spot, great fishing, lots of fun there. Two communities about 20 miles apart. Again, you'd think, how different could they possibly be down here on the Kenai Peninsula? Well, they're very different, and especially in terms of their experience with the spruce bark beetle outbreak. So here's a quote from someone from Homer that typifies some of this response that they had, and you can think about that grief cycle when you read this. I think the people were in love with spruce trees. When I first lived here, I lived in 20 acres of spruce trees, and I lived like a hobbit. I couldn't see my neighbors. I couldn't even find my way until I had a road built. I'd get lost walking through the trail, through the hobbit forest with mushrooms and thick moss and dripping, towering, majestic spruce. Oh, I was in love with them. And then they all got sick and died, so people grieved in that process majorly, and they cried over it. It was so sad to see all those trees die around their homes. Not everyone in Homer feels this way. But it is somewhat of a dominant message that in 2002 and 2003, people were grieving the loss of their forests around this place that they had either lived in for a long time, but more importantly, had probably moved there to get away from all the rest of us in the lower 48, and they loved their forest landscape. But just up the road in Anchor Point, someone said it actually provided a little economic boost. We saw logging companies move in. Of course, anytime you have that economic boost, you see new families moving into the area, starting new businesses or spending their money locally. It was devastating to see it happen, but at the same time, economically, it did help the community. And folks in this community wanted more logging. They did not want to see these dead trees go to waste. Right? They were adamant that we have an industry, a timber industry, to combat this issue, to provide economic well-being for the people who lived there. And so local culture and place really matters. Right? Two communities side by side may experience things very differently and therefore want very different outcomes. Well, let's shift down to Colorado. This red box here on the mountain pine beetle, spruce bark beetle timeline is when I was there doing interviews and surveys, collecting data in 9 communities in the north central Rockies there. And again, as I said, more recently we've been looking back on this situation to look at how the coverage happened in the news media, and I'll get back to that. These were the 9 communities that we were working in for this study. And you can probably pick up on a little bit of difference amongst these communities. You've probably heard of Vail and Breckenridge and Steamboat Springs, but you might not have heard of Kremling or Granby or Walden. They're not the ski resort communities in Colorado. So all of a sudden you've got a sense that, picking up on the last stories, we might have something a little bit different going on. And in fact, I'm giving away the takeaway message. We definitely do. So what do we have here? So think back to that human nature relationship typology that I shared with you earlier. And as you go from the ranch communities to the resort communities, you would think that we might have some very different human-nature relationships going on there. And what we picked up in a snapshot survey gives us somewhat of an indication that in some ways, folks aren't too different about this. There's broad agreement that forests give us a sense of peace and well-being, and that it's important to maintain forests for future generations, right? But when we get down to asking the questions about, well, should we let nature run its course? Should forests be left to grow, develop, and succumb to natural forces without being managed by humans? Well, you see about 30 to 40% of the folks in those more resort communities agreeing with that. Let's let Mother Nature do her thing here. When you get out to those more ranching communities with a little bit more of a logging history, you start to see that decline. And what you start to see picking up in those communities is this sense that forests that are not used for the benefit of humans are a waste of our natural resources. And so you can see that we've got in these communities a few different perspectives going on with a few more dominant than the other. But let's not forget that first type on that list of human nature relationships, and that's apathy, right? As many or more folks that said that forests should be left to succumb to natural forces without being managed by humans, as many or more said they didn't really have an opinion on this, right? So not everybody's thinking about ecosystem services in the same way. So environmental perspectives can differ both across our communities and within them. Well, and these different perspectives about what's going on in the forests lead people to have different opinions on what they'd like to see in response. And so the industry options, the forest industry options in regard to the bark beetles in Colorado looked quite different, as you can imagine, across these different communities. And out in those resort communities, you know, you still had about 50% of folks saying it would be all right to have some biomass generation or even some small-scale timber processing, and certainly some niche marketing, and we can sell them at our little boutique furniture shop. That'll be just fine. But don't you dare think about bringing one of those big, large timber processing facilities into our resort town. You have to be out of your mind. But go down to Walden, and that's precisely what they want and need and what they'd had in the past and what they got, right? So it's really important to think about the local settings when we're thinking about what's going to be appropriate as we deal with these disturbances and as they roll out. So the takeaway message here is that one size just does not fit all when we think about our even within one landscape of a 9-community area, a 5-county area in the state of Colorado. But we needed to think about alternatives to how we respond to this in a regional way. Well, when we look back over these last 15 years or so, it's interesting to see the coverage, just the volume of the news media coverage from 4 newspapers, the Vail paper, Summit Daily News, Granby, and Steamboat Springs, same general area. The line here, that brown line there, is the volume of newspaper articles that are about beetles. And you can see that it mirrors, interestingly, that mountain pine beetle outbreak that was the more dominant in the state. But you can see that in the last couple of years that spruce bark beetle portion has popped up there. It's not as many acres of spruce, but it's there and affecting some communities more than others. So we looked into this news coverage to see what was going on here and what we could find. And in those early years when I was first starting to do some work in here, the articles were, you know, awaiting a perfect storm of drought on pine beetles and pondering the potential deadly toll, so anticipating this problem coming. And then we move on into 2006 and 2007, and the beetles come across the divide and the outlook looks grim. We've got a bark beetle battle on our hands in Breckenridge, and we're seeking $22 million for the beetle battle. This epidemic can't be stopped. It's a runaway train. We're looking for more money for our dying Colorado forests. The devastation's growing in Vail. But a little bit by 2009, well, life gives you beetles. Maybe we ought to make some benches. But we better be cautious when we're out there playing in the forest because there's some dead trees and they're falling over fast. And then we start to see Frisco says they're moving slowly to replant after the pine beetle. They're looking to the future forest around Frisco, and Summit County businesses turning the beetle kill into profit. But looking at some of the longer term impacts of what this beetle situation might mean for snowpack and melt and water resources. I know there's a great poster back there on this interaction here. But we start to see articles pointing to a new forest is on the way, and we can use that to down timber for biomass. And we're thinking about after the beetle and the epidemic did change the face of our forests, but we're looking back on something. And nature's improving our forests. Don't interfere. And the cooperatives discussing their future planning efforts. But on the other hand, on the horizon here comes those spruce bugs. And will the future of Colorado, will they have forests? And you can start to see this grief cycle and how it gets a little bit tangled, even just looking at the news media coverage. The point here is that time matters, right? And our relationships with nature are not just complicated in a moment, they're complicated over time as we experience these sorts of dynamics. And you can see some of these things in the news, just in the news headings. And yet what's on the horizon here is a complex set of interacting forces that they probably have to continue to deal with. Coming a little closer to home here, and about wrapped up here, we've got a 9-county Wasatch region that we're interested in studying, right? And over the last year or so, I've had a team of students, undergraduates and graduates, who've gone out to conduct interviews with folks to just ask some open-ended questions. What do you think about the values, the benefits of the Wasatch Mountains, living in the Wasatch? What's the state of well-being in this region? How do the mountains contribute to that? And what are the threats or vulnerabilities posed by living in the Wasatch Mountains? And are you aware of any sustainability or issues, and are you involved in that? Looking forward to the future sustainability of this region. And so our students went out and talked to planners, emergency managers, natural resource managers, and environmental consultants, folks that have environmental or recreation interests, and some real estate and business development interests as well. Let's see, where's my moderator here? How much time do we have? About 5 minutes? Okay, perfect. And if you want to see more, the students put a great little 5-minute video together that you could take a look at and hear some of the voices that we heard on this. But interestingly enough, so here's a little matrix. These are the folks that we talked to, right? Here's our 80 key informants in this region from up here in the northern Wasatch, moving on south, but including the front and the back. When you look at how many of these folks are talking about forest issues, it was only about 35% of these folks brought up trees or forests at all, either as benefits or as threats. And when you look into this set of 28 people even further, 17 of them mentioned fire, right? About 61% of those folks, but it was really only 21% of those overall people talking about the Wasatch. Only 6 mentioned active involvement or awareness of forest restoration or management efforts, and only 1 person mentioned beetles. And interestingly enough, that person was in the Wasatch Back, all right, had been involved in some of the spruce beetle issues here in the state of Utah, but it largely was not on the radar of this 80 people we talked to. Now, are they fully representative of everyone in the Wasatch region? Not necessarily, but we think we've come at this from a number of angles to tell an interesting story. You know, so we have different perspectives. We've got issues with wildfire because we've got people living right up against the forest boundary. Some of them aren't always careful with fire, so we'll get fire issues, and managing fuels is always a concern. So there's a focus on mitigating some of the hazards in the wildland-urban interface that we're hearing pop up. We also hear, though, about this notion, much more of a participant notion or a partner notion of human-nature relationships. Someone who said, I don't really believe fire is an environmental hazard. It's a natural system and a process that's a requirement for sustaining a healthy environment, right? You don't get diversity in our vegetation and our forests if you don't have fires to get the pine trees. It's the fault of our communities to not live in harmony with the natural environment that we, in essence, invaded. So we have some different human-nature relationships popping up in our conversations with folks. But disturbances are not necessarily always anticipated by everyone. You know, there are people, this person said, who do feel, you know, that there are some residents that are aware of the danger, especially those who live closest to the Forest Service ground. But for the most part, our residents just think of our trees as a beautiful amenity, which they are, but they don't realize that it's also a potential fire hazard. So the anticipation of disturbances in the interactions here is something that our informants are telling us is not necessarily always on the radar for folks. But 68 out of these 80 folks, 68 of the 80 folks we talked to did talk about water, 85%. So as people are thinking about our natural resource issues, water is far more on the agenda than our forest issues. But we don't see much connection of these issues. We're not seeing amongst this set of interviews at least that there's much of a sense of a forest-water nexus. And yet our natural resource managers and our natural resource scientists and climatologists, hydrologists, and ecologists are telling us that this is an interactive set of issues that we really need to be thinking about, particularly if the form of our precipitation might be changing and we might have more extreme events. Looking at this interaction will be very, very important. So looking forward in the Wasatch, we've got a different sort of anticipatory sort of situation that we're hearing from folks. And on the one hand, we have folks that are telling us, well, we really need to mitigate these hazards. We need to control some of the natural processes or the built processes in the wildland-urban interface to protect people and to enable this rich, vibrant growth and development that we're seeing in Utah. They identify the hazards, the landscapes, the faults, the flooding, that flooding and groundwater interactions, and that they're hazards to the development. But on the other hand, we also have folks that say that ecosystem disturbances are natural and that development is actually threatening environmental processes and that the Wasatch is being loved to death. And the biggest issues are the population and the need to plan for the population growth, dealing with issues of air quality and water for a broader sense of ecosystem sustainability. So the anticipation of issues varies in here in the Wasatch region. So just wrapping things up, when it comes to making sense of community responses to ecosystem disturbances, a few things we can think about. Experience matters, right? What experiences in the communities that you will be working in and around, what experiences have they had with issues and disturbances? What's the place like? What's the local culture, all right? And coming to grips with the fact that environmental perspectives and human nature relationships might vary within and across the communities that we interact with, and that one size is not likely to fit all as we roll out our strategies for dealing with ecosystem disturbances. And that things can change over time. On the Kenai Peninsula, when I first got there, we had anger and crying, and by the time I went back 4 years later, they were like, Beetles? Oh yeah, Beetles. But look at this beautiful view we have now that we cut down all the trees. Isn't it gorgeous? So time makes a difference, all right? In Utah, we're not seeing a forest-water nexus on the radar, and anticipation is different and varies across our different vantage points. So what does this call for? Come on, almost done. What I would call for is we need more longitudinal studies to capture the changes in our human nature relationships. You know, our funding cycle for research, we might get a project for 2-3 years, right? And then that funding dries up and blows away and the project's done and the professor moves off to study farmers in Illinois or whatever else. But we need to be studying these things rolling out over a longer period of time to see how these interactions shape our landscapes. And I would say also that integrating social sciences with the natural sciences and resource management will help us to inform adaptive decisions and actions. And then we have to do this integration early in our problem formulation stage. We can't just wait and bring in the social scientists at the last minute when all the information's gotten too complicated for the biophysical scientists to store it out. And I would also say that integrating, going beyond science knowledge to integrate local and professional knowledge that it will inform context-relevant, holistic understanding of ecosystem disturbances and response. And I have to put a little plug in here for the brand new Climate Adaptation Science graduate training program that we've just received funding for from NSF here at Utah State University. And over the next 5 years, and hopefully far beyond, we will be training students in many different disciplines related to climate adaptation science, but also also looking at the science, management, policy, real-world connections. And so send us your best and your brightest as master's or PhD students, and we will try to bring them in through this integrative, interdisciplinary learning together. And with that, if I can get the buttons to work, we might need new batteries here. I thank you, and I thank the funders of this research. Thank you.
I like your idea of understanding the local communities and the example in Colorado, but how does that play off against federal lands? And I know a lot of folks in this room face these. It's wonderful to understand the local communities and maybe even play along with them. But there's just a strong force saying, these are my lands, and I might be from Maine or North Dakota or wherever. So if you could respond to that.
I think that's a very good point, and we have to think about scale, and my work has been focused at local and regional scales, but of course the driving forces for what's happening across our western landscapes is we have these vast swaths of land that is under the jurisdiction of our federal land management agencies, and of course our part of the commons, so to speak, for folks across the country. And I think that just as we study local residents, we also need to think about studying the perspectives of those who are visiting, all right, and spending money locally, but also those who are back all the way back in DC or back in Denver or in our big decision centers. What are their human nature relationships, and what are these policies being based upon, and are they at odds with or consistent with how the ecosystem disturbances are rolling out, and where we have the frictions like we do in Utah over public lands. In some ways it's because we have different opinions about different human nature relationships and a different sense of how those human nature relationships should be governed. And I'm not going to weigh in on what's right or wrong, but the sooner that we reconcile that we have differences in perspectives and bring them all to the table and work those things out in earlier stages rather than late in the game, I think we can mitigate some of those conflicts. But it does take a multi-scale approach to thinking about this and multi-actors in the system. Thank you. Yeah, Darren?
Courtney, how do you recommend that we approach the forest and water nexus without falling into the trap of the information deficit model?
So the question is, how do we get to the forest-water nexus without falling into the trap of the information deficit model? You know who understands the forest-water nexus are the people who live in the communities, who live in the forest and do deal with water issues and drought and so forth. And there's a lot of professional knowledge. And I'd say that the real target folks are people who are in this room, who are managing natural resources, but at a local to regional scale. They not only understand and see these interactions, they also know the local folks in those communities, and they're poised to bring these folks into conversations early on, to think about learning from their knowledge and their experiences, creating more open dialogue so that it's a multi-directional flow of information. The information deficit model falls short when we think of it as being one direction, right? From science to the people, right? When we open up that flow of conversation and bring in the vantage points from locals and professionals in the landscapes and blend that with the science and do that in earlier stages, we can start to build, we can formulate problems and we can develop strategies that might avoid some of these barriers to that flow of information. And I think extension plays a key role in that in our land-grant universities. It plays a key role in opening up those conversations to be multidimensional.
Amen, sister.
All right.
Thanks, Dr. Flint.
Thank you very much.